All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Chamber of Commerce's Pulse on Policy. You joined us today for a preview of the City of Austin's proposed budget, and we're super fortunate today to have Spencer Cronk with us. My name is Laura Huffman. I am the President and CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, and I want to thank each and every one of you for making time in your busy day to join us for this webinar. There's no question this is a difficult time for us. Please know that the Chamber is doing everything it can to deliver content to you, to participate, and lead the task force on reopening business in Central Texas with an eye towards public health. If you haven't heard about it, we recently launched the Austin, A City of Us campaign. And the theme of this campaign is a mask on each of us is a win for all of us, and that there is an us in Austin. I especially want to thank our sponsors for today's event. As we move all of our content from our wonderful in-person meetings, which I know we all miss, to doing these things online, we are particularly grateful that AT&T and Amazon are staying with us as sponsors. AT&T, of course, is our presenting sponsor, and our sustaining sponsor is Amazon. And now more than ever, we need to stay connected and keep on top of what's happening in the community. And thank you both for allowing us to do that. We have with us today Erin Burgett, who is the Director of External and Legislative Affairs, where she manages government and community relations in Austin on behalf of AT&T. Please welcome Erin Burgett as she introduces the City Manager, Spencer Cronk. And please join all of us in welcoming you to the chat room and to the Q&A room. We're all monitoring this, and we want to make sure that this is a lively discussion. Erin, I will now thank you and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Laura. Well, as Laura said, we're really excited to have City Manager Spencer Cronk joining us for today's Pulse on Policy, and we're very appreciative of all the work he's doing for our city during this unprecedented times. City Manager Spencer Cronk was appointed by City Council in February 2018 and serves as the Chief Administrative and Executive Officer at the city, where he directs day-to-day operations as well as provides strategic research and recommendations to the City Council on city's programs, policies, services, and on the $4.2 billion city budget. Now on the job for a little over 2 years, Spencer and his executive team continue to advance the work of the city's 5-year strategic plan, Strategic Direction 2023. Prior to his arrival in Austin, Cronk played a similar role in Minneapolis as their city administrator, where he provided leadership in the management of Minneapolis city government by assisting the mayor and council in defining city policy, establishing priorities, and strengthening the administrative systems of the city. Cronk is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and of Harvard University's Senior Executives in State and Local Government program. He was selected to join the inaugural Young American Leaders program at Harvard Business School and served as president of the National Association of State Chief Administrators. So we're very lucky to have City Manager Spencer Cronk. I want to thank him for taking the time to be here today, and I'll hand it over to him to give us a preview of the proposed city budget.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Erin, and I really want to thank the Chamber for having me. I have some prepared remarks, so we'll have a brief presentation, and then I really look forward to the Q&A, which will be the majority of, I think, why you're here, so we can have some lively discussion around the proposed budget. I'll also note that joining me is our Deputy CFO, Ed Banino. I was told early on in my career that you need to surround yourself with people that are smarter than you, and I've certainly done that with Ed. As Erin mentioned, it's been over 2 years, and I've seen a lot of things and some challenges that the city of Austin has faced. We had the horrific bombings in March of 2018. We had the Colorado River flooding incident in October of 2018. We had toxic algae issues that were impacting our pets and our animals. And now we have another crisis to add to that, and that's the pandemic. But I also want to highlight some really promising things that I've seen since I came here. We have introduced the Army Futures Command to our community. We've seen Apple make some incredible investments. We have a new soccer stadium coming online, as well as a new basketball arena that are privately financed. Now we're in really intense conversations with Tesla to have a gigafactory here in Austin. It shows you that we're a resilient community, and your investments as our business community are so critical to not only how we've navigated through past crises, past challenges, but how we will get through this. And so I just want to start out by thanking you for your investment and commitment to Austin, because it's not something that I take for granted. Now I'm here to talk about the budget, and it's really one of the most challenging budgets that we've had to put together in recent memory. As you know, our community is facing not just one, but two momentous crises. We remain engulfed in the global COVID-19 pandemic, which has caused tragic loss in our community. It's upended our way of life and triggered an unprecedentedly swift economic contraction. At the same time, our city is taking new steps to confront and end the long history of systemic injustices experienced by people of color by our public safety institutions. In times of crisis, a budget acts as a path forward, helping us use our limited resources wisely and purposefully. The proposed fiscal year 2021 budget meets these crises head on, building on the tireless work of our public health team and countless other city staff in combating COVID-19 and helping our community recover from its effects. This budget also accelerates the process of reimagining our public safety system to ensure justice and equal treatment for all Austin residents. Now, it's nearly impossible to overstate the magnitude of the challenge that COVID-19 has presented, not just for the city of Austin as an organization, but for our entire community. The loss felt in our community and the strain that it has placed on everyone's resources, including its adverse financial strain. Across all city funds, we anticipate ending the current fiscal year over $200 million, or nearly 5% below budgeted projections. As a result of travel and tourism-related mandates to mitigate the spread of the disease, our airport and convention center have been particularly hard hit. These departments have anticipated revenue shortfalls of approximately 30%. And at the same time, there's an unprecedented demand for additional resources to respond to and emerge from this crisis. To help meet that demand, we are leveraging our federal funding provided through the CARES Act to support a $272 million framework for the city's COVID-19 response. That include planned expenditures of $106 million for emergency response, $63 million for medical and public health needs, and $103 million for programs providing economic support. Despite these challenges, the budget I presented to Council on Monday is one of a remarkable, resilient city. A feat possible because of a long commitment to prudent financial management. Our robust reserve position accumulated through years of conservative revenue projections, responsible budgeting, and proactive financial management has prevented the layoffs and furloughs required in other cities. We also haven't seen any cut to our city services that you often see in other cities that are dealing with this pandemic. Instead, we have reprioritized our staff to maximize the breadth and effectiveness of our COVID response. Our strong financial position has allowed us to put our community first. And because we cannot know how long this crisis will last or when the next one will strike, this budget doubles down on these principles to ensure our continued resiliency. Even in the face of COVID, this budget projects restoring general fund reserves to a healthy 12% level. And importantly, it achieves this without resorting to significant increases in taxes and fees at a time when so many of our residents are experiencing financial strain. So when looking at city taxes and fees paid by a homeowner in our community, this budget proposes only a 3.5% effective property tax increase for general fund maintenance and operations, the lowest such increase since fiscal year 2004-2005. I'll just repeat that. That's the lowest such increase in over 15 years. Rates charged by city enterprise departments are likewise being held at a minimum, with proposed increases in Austin Resource Recovery and the transportation user fee being offset by a decrease in the average Austin energy bill. Collectively, a typical Austinite can expect to see a combined tax and fee bill increase of only $1 per month. This modest tax rate proposal recognizes the possible November tax rate election to fund Project Connect. the transformative new multimodal transit system that the city has been developing in partnership with Capital Metro. Although COVID-19's financial impacts to the city budget are dire, we also must recognize that they are temporary. Weathering this crisis should not jeopardize our once-in-a-generation opportunity to revolutionize our transportation infrastructure. COVID's impacts have created historic levels of volatility in the economy and city revenue sources that are likely to persist for some time. This budget includes measures to improve the city's long-term resiliency to these conditions and to crises in the future. We continue to streamline operations to improve efficiency of service delivery by reorganizing and consolidating the functions of several departments and offices. This will synergize our missions, streamline our management structure, and provide greater clarity to the residents and stakeholders as they navigate city administration. I'll point out that this also includes a new housing and planning department, replacing and improving upon the services previously provided by our neighborhood housing and community development department and planning and zoning department. Beyond efficiency, this change reflects our recognition of the connection between affordable housing and land use across the city. Now at this time, I'd like to ask Lacey to bring up the slide deck so we can drill down a bit deeper into the details, because I know this group likes to do that. We'll start with the top line of how this proposed budget would impact a typical taxpayer. So as you can see on this slide, the Austin Energy bill will be reduced by about $41 per year for the typical ratepayer. And you can see how each area is defining a typical ratepayer. We have no increases proposed for Austin Water, our clean community fee, or a drainage utility fee. And we do see a small $2.50 per month increase for Austin Resource Recovery that will allow us to fully implement our organics recycling. We also see a $0.25 per month increase in our transportation user fee. And then as noted, a small impact in our property tax bill at that 3.5% rate. Overall, that's an annual dollar change from the previous year of $12.53, which is a projected increase of just 0.3% from last year. I'm going to pause and just see if our Deputy CFO wants to highlight anything that I missed on this slide. I just want to make sure that as everyone's looking at the proposed tax increases for next year with this budget, that I'm not missing anything.
No, I think you covered it very well, Spencer. I would just mention that we do have a broader taxpayer impact statement that includes all this information and also gives a further breakdown depending upon if you're a senior and you get the senior exemption, or if you're not a senior, and for different values of homes. So you can really dial the tax implications into your own specific circumstance, and that's available at the city's website.
Great. So we'll go to the next slide, please. I wanted to spend a little bit of time drilling deeper into the discussion around reimagining public safety at this point. As you know, the horrific deaths of George Floyd in Minneapolis and Michael Ramos here in Austin have really caused our community to think differently about how we would want to move forward with public safety. Our city council passed some very specific resolutions back in June, and this budget that's proposed in the short amount of time that we had to respond to those resolutions allows us to take those considerations, put them in the budget, but recognize that it's just step one of a multi-step process in reimagining our public safety system. Those resolutions, including direction to eliminate vacant officer positions, including police officers that were part of a police staffing plan, and vacant positions that could not be reasonably filled in this coming year. It also asked the manager to delay the June cadet class, and that resulted in some savings, and delaying the scheduled replacement of any duty weapons. Those are reductions of our projected budget when we had this back in January of $11.3 million. Next slide, please. That $11.3 million was then reallocated based on council direction to a number of important services, including additional funding for our Office of Police Oversight and our Equity Office, money to increase our resources for mental health first response. Also to ensure that we were responding to the Tatum investigation and ensuring that we had an improved records management system for our police department. There's a number of other things that are highlighted here, but I'll just note that the 11.3 million that was resulted in savings from those initial reallocations is moving into these areas. And that was an important first step to think about how we might think differently about our public safety system. But within just a couple weeks from that June resolution to when we needed to crunch all the numbers and put everything together for this budget, we knew that that was just a step. And the next step is on the next slide, which is really how we re-envision this entire process. We knew that this budget wasn't going to be a budget that was set in stone, that this is a moment in time. Not only are we dealing with the pandemic, which will change and evolve, and we need to respond and adapt depending on how our community responds to the pandemic, and that we need more input and buy-in from our community about what public safety looks like in the future. And so this chart outlines how we will have public input for this budget adoption, this moment in time, but we know that we have much more to talk about. And we've listed a number of key areas that we are going to spend the next several months and years thinking about in a broad way with our community. We need to really examine what calls are we getting and who is responding to those calls from a dispatch perspective. That will take some time to get the appropriate players in the room, talking to each other, and ensuring that we have a common goal and a common path forward about how we want to think about those services differently going forward. I've listed a number of them here, but there are others, and I think that we will continue to grow this list as we hear from more members of our community. I've tasked our Deputy City Manager, Nuria Rivera-Vandermine, Assistant City Managers Chris Shorter and Ray Ariano to lead a group within the city that consists of our Equity Office, our Office of Police Oversight, and our Police Department, but also includes more broadly ways in which we will engage key stakeholders, including the Chamber, but other members of our community as we move forward with these discussions. We don't know what that future state will be. And when we do, and when we determine what those key recommendations that will come from these task force result, then we will bring those back to council with budget amendments over the next year. So this is a phased approach. We know we have to be thoughtful in it, but there will not be anything that will happen overnight regarding how we think differently about our public safety infrastructure. Next slide, please. The next handful of slides are just key highlights from each of the outcome areas. Aaron mentioned that we are still operating from a overall framework around our strategic direction 2023. This was something that our community and our council and our city staff put together even before I started, but it was a gift that I walked into because it allowed us to not only put the resources in place from a personnel standpoint. I've reorganized my city executives around these outcome areas. We've also reorganized our budget around these areas, and we're holding ourselves accountable around these areas. We now have a dashboard that has gone live, and we have key metrics and indicators of how we are doing in each of the outcome areas that you'll see here. But for the purposes of this budget, I just wanted to put these few slides up to give a couple examples of things that are in this budget on each of these outcome areas. So you'll see additional assistance for homeowner assistance programs. I talked about the Planning and Development Center, and we continue to support increases in workforce development programming. Next slide. We know that we are being threatened from a cybersecurity standpoint, and so we've created a new information security office to help combat that from the city of Austin. I talked about increases within the equity office, but we also know that we have assets that we need to continue to maintain, and so we're able to make those critical investments with this budget as well. Next slide. I'll highlight here that we're able to continue to invest in our cultural centers, but as a result of the decrease in our hotel occupancy tax, I will just point out that we're going to see a significant reduction in funding for cultural arts, historic preservation, and live music. That will be very difficult for our cultural communities to address. And I actually ask and have a request for this group to see what they can do, whether on a personal or professional level, to double down on your investments for our important cultural and arts communities here in Austin. Because we haven't had that resource in the same way that we've had in the past, we know that we need to continue to support these groups moving forward. This is a critical time for them, and anything that you can do to step up your efforts will be important. Next slide, please. A few highlights from our health and environment outcome area. Again, mentioning the organic collection program. We continue to support our homeless services by providing emergency shelters, our Violet Leg program, which helps clean up under underpasses, and then increasing resources for our mental health responses. Next slide, please. And then our mobility programs. Obviously, we need more ways in which we can walk and bike and get around from A to B. And so making sure that we have the appropriate investments in our sidewalk systems and other ways in which we can improve mobility throughout the city. Next slide, please. Finally, our safety program, we continue to grow as a city, and so we did have a plan for adding additional fire stations, EMS stations over the years. It was important as part of this proposed budget to continue that, so we're not seeing any decreases in response times, and so we will be opening a new Travis Country Fire EMS station in July of 2021. This budget includes funding for that, and then additional funding for other improvements within our existing EMS stations. Next slide, and I think that was the final slide. Oh, this is the final slide is how you can get engaged, how to make sure that you know that this is one step in the process. The first step is having the budget presented by the city manager to the city council, allowing the community and the council to engage in conversations on what that proposed budget looks like. Those input meetings are going to be on the 23rd of July and the 30th of July. We're going to have work sessions within City Council on the 28th and on August 4th. And then there will be the budget adoption process that starts on August 12th. With that, I just wanted to open it back up and really appreciate the Chamber for allowing me this time. I'm excited that we're going to have a good, robust conversation and Q&A, and so I'm looking forward to the questions. But thank you again for having me, and I look forward to talking more about this year's budget.
Spencer, thank you. And Ed, thank you for joining us as well. Okay, the Q&A is up, and we've got some questions coming in. Spencer, the first one is, how would the street impact fee that are expected to be implemented tie into this budget?
Great. So I know that's a discussion that we're about to have with our council. I believe it's on the 30th agenda, and so we will be continuing to move forward with that. I'm going to pass it over to Ed to see if he can explain exactly how that connects to this year's budget.
Well, as Spencer said, we're going to continue to have the conversation, and then, you know, with this budget, as those fees are starting to be assessed, there'll be a source of funding in the budget to, for the various projects that those dollars are going to be used for the various street improvements that'll come out of that fee.
Great. And then pulling the cameras back a little bit, this one is more about COVID response. Spencer, what is the strategy in balancing funding? And I think here we're talking about city funds as well as recovery funds to support businesses in maintaining and creating jobs versus direct financial assistance at the individual level?
Yeah. That's a great question, and I don't think there's an easy answer for that because it is always trying to find what that right balance is. Obviously, we have individuals that are suffering greatly from this economic recession. We know that even paying rents, getting groceries, paying for medical expenses are really straining our community. But we also know that we need a strong business community that provides those jobs. We have an incredible business community with the Chamber, and I think our small businesses in particular the ones that are being the most hard hit in this economic recession, need to be supported. And so we had some, I think, healthy discussions within city governments as we looked at that framework for how to use federal resources. And I think we found a good balance between putting resources for direct assistance for individuals and providing grant and loan programs for our small business community in Austin. That said, we know that we could always use more. And we know that we're hearing from all parts of our community that they're being impacted by this economic recession. So I think hearing from you as a chamber, I think hearing from your members, hearing individual stories about how assistance could be more helpful to you, what you could do with that, how it could keep you afloat for a few more months or whatever those situations are. Not only talking to city staff, we have a great chief resilience officer, economic recovery officer, I'm sorry, in Veronica Briceño, who's taken on this role in this environment. And then also to our city council to ensure that as we think about these decisions, these trade-offs, if you will, with limited resources, they're hearing stories from the business community as well.
And let's go one more level below that on economic recovery. And we have been working with Veronica with the task force and other efforts, knowing that economic recovery does require focus and investment by the city. What is in the budget to recruit and retain businesses and create jobs in our community?
Yeah, I think I said before, but we've been fortunate that we have not had to cut any of our current programs or services in this budget. And so, you know, that's again a result of having strong reserves, being conservative in our planning, being creative in how we're using our federal assistance. But the short answer is whatever we had been doing before will continue. We're having to make adjustments based on the current environment, but fortunately you won't see any cuts in those services. So I think that's a good news story at this point. We are now with the federal funding allowing some additional programs to be implemented that would support those businesses. But it is a constant challenge, and I will say that I'm proud that the city has always looked to partnerships and looked to ways in which we can leverage the good work that's happening throughout our community. Ed, were there any programs you wanted to highlight in particular on this front?
No, just to, maybe just to double down on what you're saying is all of our economic development department's business recruitment and retention activities are continuing forward. I think importantly, all of our 380 economic incentive agreements are continuing forward. I have heard from some other cities, where they're having discussions about scaling back those incentive agreements that are important to job creation. Workforce development programs are all continuing forward. So, I think there's a lot of things in this budget that are going to be, as always, there are to support our local businesses. And as Spencer said, none of those programs are being cut back, which I think is very fortunate for us. Oh, I will also say that we're continuing to explore the creation of an economic development corporation, which will provide additional economic benefits to the community.
Great. Okay, next question on a completely different topic. Can you give a little more detail about cybersecurity, the response team that you mentioned? And is that part of the CTM or is it a new initiative? And if so, how would we be able to get more involved?
Great. Well, certainly I'll make sure that folks have my email address and they can contact me directly, whether on this topic or another topic. But, we've always had a information security office within our communications technology management department, CTM, but it has been somewhat embedded in that area. As we've seen cyber attacks happen, not only with jurisdictions, but more public institutions across the country, we knew we had to further shore up our resources and get more savvy and make sure that we're able to be responsive to those threats. So we have then pulled out that office, given it more staff and more resources to ensure that it has the scope and scale and authority that it needs. We recently passed a new ordinance that created this office as a standalone office, and then went through a executive recruitment and was able to hire a new chief information security officer. And so this is really amplifying those efforts, and I look forward to talking and partnering with whoever had asked that question. So please connect with us.
Great, thank you, Spencer. Switching gears now to public safety, how will you involve the community and local businesses in the discussion around reimagining public safety?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that, we're just getting started with defining those stakeholder groups. I know that it's been very important as we move forward with this process to really lift up and put at the center of these discussions those individuals and communities that have been most impacted by our public safety departments, disproportionately impacted by our public safety departments. And so we have been working with different community groups at this point, but we are going to start to broaden that discussion to ensure that everyone has a chance to weigh in on what public safety means for them. Because obviously it means very different things to different people, and we do have a very diverse community here. But what is clear is what currently is happening, the status quo, cannot exist moving forward. We do have to change things. We do have to reimagine what that looks like for the city of Austin moving forward. It's going to be different than other cities. It's going to be different for different areas, even within public safety. So all those areas that I mentioned in that slide need a thorough examination, and different people will be part of that depending on how engaged you want to get in those discussions. But we will be putting out more information about what those work groups look like, how you as individuals or as organizations can tap into and provide feedback for our path forward, because hearing all those voices will be critical if we're going to have a consensus or have an agreement around what public safety looks like for Austin. That I keep going back to, public safety is one of the core elements of city government, and it's how we keep our citizenry safe. We need to ensure that we are doing that, but we need to do that in ways that build on the trust and accountability that we have had and that has been now broken with our community. So I'm looking forward to finding ways to build on that trust, but that will only happen through engagement and participation.
Okay, then continuing on that theme, Spencer, what metrics will be put in place to measure the effectiveness for police?
Yeah, so we've had metrics, and some of those I talked about a little bit in having as part of our strategic direction, and so they're part of a dashboard. We'll try to find a link that we can share either on the chat or afterwards, so you can see them yourself. But those are evolving as well, and so as we get more information, as we hear more from the community, there might be different ways that we're parsing out that information that will be more relevant for our community members. But I do think over the course of these discussions, I hope that it's data driven. I hope that we're really looking at what is the expectation for our community for a response time for X type of incident? Who do you want responding to those incidences? And so I think we need to have that type of agreement around what is the expectation for you as our citizens, as our taxpayers, for having what you would want from our public safety institutions. So I think both seeing what metrics we currently have been using, having a robust discussion around those specific areas that we're going to be looking at, and having that be data driven as well will be critical.
Okay. Then another question is, understanding that the 100 officer positions were vacant and now there are no vacancies, delayed the cadet class, what is the plan to replace retirements and resignations? Would those two things result in fewer officers on the street in 2021?
I mean, the short answer is yes, it could do that because we are not currently able to keep up with the vacancy rate. I think we're very measured in what we're able to do at this point in time. We're not reducing any officer positions that currently exist or currently occupied. So the kind of boots on the ground is not changing with this proposed budget. That said, over time, we could see some of that impact. But what I want to make sure that we're reserving space for is having a discussion with our community about what that looks like. Are you okay with that type of change? How do you want to see our officers interacting with our community going forward? How do we make sure that we're putting the appropriate resources in the appropriate areas? Those are things that are going to be hard, but take time to work through. But yes, I mean, as we are growing as a city, we are not seeing, at least with this proposed budget, we had a 5-year staffing plan that we've basically put on pause. And so we will not be able to see the same level of officer investment as we did in the past. Do you want to add anything?
Okay, great.
Did I forget anything?
I would only mention that, you know, we currently have 2,000, almost 2,000 authorized sworn personnel, of which about 170 are currently vacant. You know, we do see an attrition rate of roughly 7 or 8 officers per month. And that all went into our calculus of figuring out how many of those vacant positions we could cut without impacting the timing and our ability to fill those positions. So we are still planning to have cadet classes during next year. The council resolution called for us to delay the July Cadet Academy, but we still anticipate there'll be cadet academies coming during fiscal year 21, and we'll be filling positions. But again, that was the look was taking all that information into account, including current vacancy levels, and then figuring out how many of them we'd be able to fill, not wanting to impact that, being able to fill those positions, but then reallocating the resources to those vacant positions that couldn't reasonably be filled next year.
Okay, then in this grouping, the last public safety question we've got for now is on the $13.3 million in savings for public safety, you did put up a slide to show where that money would be reallocated to. Is there anything more you want to add to that, or is there any additional detail that the question asker can turn to understand more how that reallocation is going to work?
I mean, we got a big budget book that provides a little bit more detail on what those funds would be used for. But I think the short answer is some of those things still need to be worked out. Obviously, it was a quick turnaround from when those resolutions were passed to when we had to put the budget together. And I'm talking about a week to 10 days. And so we know that some of them are even what I would call a placeholder or a bucket of funds. But we did some legwork to see is that the approximate amount of resources that would be needed. So for example, a bucket of about $3 million for resources to increase funding within the Equity Office, the Office of Police Oversight, and then to respond to some specific requests for doing an audit or redoing our general orders and doing some audits. And so we felt like that was an appropriate placeholder, but those details are still being worked out in real time. And so some of those will have more details in the budget book, but then some of them, frankly, just because of the turnaround, we weren't able to get to that level of detail.
All right, and then now let's switch gears a little bit. So we've got 2 questions about our community's most vulnerable populations. What does the budget include for social services? And in your mind, is that adequately funded, and for people experiencing homelessness?
Yeah. So I'll just be honest, I think that any budget that we put forward is not going to be sufficient in terms of how we're responding regarding our social service efforts and responding to people experiencing homelessness. We know that we have limited resources, and we're trying to be more efficient and effective at how we're using those limited resources in those areas. So for example, as part of last year's budget, we hired a consultant to help us look at all our social service contracts regarding homelessness, and make sure that we are, as a city organization, using those in the most appropriate and efficient ways. And so we're going to be seeing the results of that work in the coming weeks. But bottom line up front, we know it's not a surprise that we have to invest more in permanent supportive housing. And so we have put in significant resources, and Ed will share more detail than I can in terms of permanent supportive housing. But we know that we will not be able to do everything as a city to be able to provide the appropriate level of resources that we need. We're going to need our private sector, our public sector, our philanthropic sector to all step up to the plate to ensure that we're adequately addressing this. One area in particular, though, that I think gives hope that there are resources, we had the fortune to have our residents support a $250 million affordable housing bond in 2018. Our housing and planning department has now kind of earmarked about $30 million of that for permanent supportive housing. So we know that there are resources already available. We just have to make sure that we're purchasing the right facilities and entering the right agreements, and then we'll be bringing those to council as mid-year budget amendments. So we think we have the framework in place. We think that because of the historic investment we made last year, we're still, I would say, almost doubling the investments that we had made, I guess, before last year, but of previous years. And so we are making significant investments in not only homeless services, but social services generally. And we know that there's more that we need to do. Ed, did you want to expound anything? Nope, you're on mute, Ed.
I was just going to throw a few dollar amounts in since this is a budget conversation, but the level of effort, so to speak, in regards to our homelessness response had been on the order of magnitude of about $35 million up until fiscal year 20, the fiscal year we're currently in. And as the city manager mentioned, both the current year and into the next year, we've nearly doubled that effort. In the current year, we have a total budget of $60.9 million to respond to our homelessness crisis. That does include increased funding for permanent supportive housing, increased funding for rapid rehousing, funding for all the wraparound services, additional funding for encampment cleanups. So our emphasis on homelessness continues, and that $60.9 million doesn't include any of the bond funding yet, because we're not at a point yet where we're ready to bring forward those budget amendments, which will be part of our hotel motel conversion strategy to get additional permanent supportive housing units. So there is a tremendous amount of emphasis there. Our social service contracts, again this year, are increasing despite the COVID situation, despite our financial challenges. We continue to find ways to get more money into our social services. And this year, a part of the way we were able to do that was through the Reimagining of public safety and reallocating some of those dollars towards our public health department to add additional funding for mental health services, and family violence prevention services, as well as immigrant legal services. So it continues to be a strong area of emphasis for the city, and by design. Our council for years now have told us that they want to see increased investment in those types of services, and you know, comparatively less investment in some of the traditional approaches to public safety.
Tell us a little bit more about the city's effort and initiatives to reduce systemic racism in Austin.
Yeah, well, this is certainly something that I think our city has always put on top of mind to make sure it was a high priority. We've seen different efforts over the years, but I will say that in today's environment, it is clear that we need to do things differently. And so we're going to be building off the work that had been in the past. We have the Mayor's Task Force on Institutional Racism. We've been doing work internally within the city enterprise with our equity office, and ensuring that we look at every program, policy, and initiative within each department on how those departments, policies, and programs may disproportionately impact different communities in Austin. But we have to do more. And so what I'm excited about, and I think this is an incredible opportunity for us to look at our public safety infrastructure and reimagine that in a way that is really looking at the root causes of how we got to where we are today. We have to make sure that we are understanding that history. We have to make sure that we are hearing voices that had not been part of the discussion before. And we have to be open to completely transforming our systems as they currently exist. I believe we're in that moment. I believe that I have the staff and the team within the city that is committed to that. And I know from what I've been hearing from our community that they are also ready for that discussion as well.
Thank you, Spencer, for that. There is a question on the resilience officer. Let me scroll up to that. So Will the new resilience position budgeted for the equity office be a chief resilience officer for Austin, like they've got in El Paso, Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio, or is it something different?
I guess the short answer is yes, but it's definitely more nuanced than that. I think a lot of those cities had been supported from the Rockefeller Foundation, and they have a 100 Resilient Cities initiative. The Rockefeller Foundation has shifted gears a little bit, so we're not funding this position through that foundation, and so it doesn't have the same type of structure put on it. So on the flip side, it allows us to really think about what that resiliency looks like for the city of Austin. And we were very intentional about putting that in the equity office to make sure that we weren't talking about resiliency just even in terms of in terms of environmental resiliency. This is a matter of what are those chronic stressors that our community faces, whether it is affordable housing, making sure that we can address some of the economic hardships. These are things that we need to think more broadly about what resilience looks like for the city of Austin, and that's what this position will be doing.
Okay, and then on the housing bonds, the $250 million in housing bonds that the voters approved a couple of years ago, how much of that has been spent? How much of that will be spent in this coming year?
I'm going to pass it to Ed for that one.
I'm going to have to respond back to whoever had that question. We can provide a response to that separately. I don't have the answer off the hand.
Okay. Keep the questions coming. We've got time for a few more.
I'll just broadly say sorry, Laura. I'll just broadly say that we have been very aggressive, and this council has been very aggressive in trying to utilize and leverage those funds as quickly as possible. So I know that last year, we were able to quickly get out of the gates a number of housing projects and then use that for other rental assistance. And so there were programs that were outlined as the contract with the voters. And I know that we have been hard charging to make sure that we're not wasting any time spending that money. But obviously it's a multi-year effort, and we'll try to follow up and make sure that you have that current information. Okay.
And then you had offered to let people email you, and so I hope you don't mind, but here's Spencer's email address. It is spencer.crunk@austintexas.gov, and we will post that so that you can see that as well. Spencer, there are some comments in here, but there is a question back on public safety that I want to make sure gets out there, and that is, it has to do with the concern for having fewer officers on the street when we see the outcomes of increased police presence in Austin streets.
Yeah, and that's really the balance that we want to be talking about with our community, because just having more officers on the street doesn't mean that our community feels safer. And so how do we make sure that we're taking the feedback, reimagining and adjusting what systems currently exist to think about what makes safety for Austinites overall? That's not an easy question. I think it's been something people have been grappling with for years, but we're ready to tackle that head on. But again, what I would say is just having more officers doesn't equal more safety for many of our residents here in Austin. And so that's what we have to really question about: what does a reimagined public safety system look like for Austin?
Okay, and then something that has not yet come up is Project Connect. I don't think any final decisions have been made about tax rates and what the ballot will look like in November, but is there any insight that you can provide us on what we can expect the tax rate to be, or the increase to the tax bill?
So I think part of the conversation that's being had, and you've seen some kind of big numbers around $10 billion for the whole system. I know that both with Capital Metro and our mobility team here at the city have been working very diligently and kind of around the clock to look at what those different financing options would be assuming that there is a presentation for the voters to be able to weigh in on that discussion. You'll be hearing much more of that in the coming days. I think the next joint work session where a lot of this will be discussed is on July 27th. And so if you want to make sure that your members are paying attention to that, but that will be a key meeting where we will be having a discussion around what those increases could look like, and then what options our council and Cap Metro board might want to be pursuing as an option for the voters to address in November. Ed, did you want to add on that?
Just that it really will depend upon the conversations council is going to have in the upcoming weeks, because there's different scenarios that are being looked at, and depending upon which direction they ultimately go is going to depend upon that'll determine the cost of the system and what kind of tax rate increase will be needed to support it. So it will have an better answer to that in the weeks ahead.
Great, thanks, Ed. We have time for just a couple of more. We'll end with a very nice question, but before that, you mentioned in your presentation that the city would cut cultural arts, historic preservation, and live music. Could you reallocate hotel occupancy tax money from the Convention Center and the Tourism Bureau to arts organizations and small businesses connected to live music?
I'll have to think about that. Maybe I'll pass it to Ed in a second, but I think one good news story, if it can be good news, is we're seeing how cities across Texas and even across the country are having to kind of take back even some of the initial investments that they made in their cultural arts community because of the decrease in hotel occupancy tax revenue. And so we were able to keep our contracts that we had for this year whole. And so making sure that we kind of stayed true to what we committed to in the beginning of last, or at the beginning of last fiscal year. And so even though we've seen incredible decreases in those revenues, we wanted to make sure we had enough reserve to be able to keep those contracts in place. And we've also tried to give as much time as possible to say, here are the projections for what this coming year will look like. And so we know it's going to be difficult, but we do not have more flexibility within that hotel occupancy tax revenue source to be able to offset that. That said, we've been able to leverage the federal funding. There is possibilities of using a general fund to help offset that. But we are seeing this challenge from all parts of our community. And so it's one of these where we will not have enough resources to be able to support the need that is out there. Ed, do you want to add any more detail to that?
Just that we really can't do the reallocation suggested by the question, because state law limits how those funds are used. 15% is the maximum we can allocate to historic preservation, and then another 15% can be allocated to music and cultural arts, and the city funds it at those maximum levels. But when the dollar amount is less, 15% of less is less funding that we can use that we can direct from the hotel taxes to those programs. And we are at the maximum is the short answer already.
Ed, thanks for that. Thank you for that clarification. Spencer, last question, because you're amongst friends. How's the baby?
So I have a daughter, Lauren, who just is about 14, 15 months, and she is pretty adorable. She just yesterday finally started walking on her own, and so that's been a new challenge that we're gonna have to face in our household of trying to keep after her, but she's great. Thank you for asking.
You bet. Okay, we're coming up on the hour now. Let me just extend a very hearty thank you, Spencer and Ed, for joining us and helping us to understand the city's budget. It's a big budget. It's a complicated budget. I think that we've all gotten a few takeaways. One of the most important of which is the 3.5% increase over last year's budget, which I think you said represents the lowest tax increase in 15 years.
Yes.
So thank you for joining us and answering the questions. If you all have any other follow-up questions, let us know and we'll work through them with you. I want to again thank AT&T and Amazon for sponsoring this Pulse on Policy series. It's important for us to be able to communicate with you what's going on in and around Austin. While many of us are working from home, there are a lot of big issues happening in our community that require your attention and your input, as Spencer mentioned several times. Weighing in from your perspective as a business owner and as a chamber member is really, really important to the process, and we want to facilitate that. So AT&T and Amazon, thank you for helping with that. And a couple of calendar items before we wrap up. July 21st is the mid-year economic update with the chief economist from RSM. August 10th is the Power Up Tech Talk with Hugh Forrest and Preston James. July 28th will be the Austin Gives Generous Business Awards virtual event. And August 20th is Accelerate, How Transit Projects Create Economic Opportunity for Austin. So there's lots of good content coming your way in the next few weeks. There will be throughout the fall. And I want to thank everybody that joined us for this Pulse on Policy. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.